Hello, so this is Module 10, and in this module we're going to be talking about one of the more pro-social behaviors that people do when they interact with each other, which is liking each other, forming relationships with one another, or even forming intimate relationships with one another. And intimacy encompasses everything from actual sexual intercourse to just the sharing of intimate details about one's life with someone else. So intimacy doesn't automatically just mean sex. But it's really interesting when people think about, well, why do you like the people that you like? Why are you attracted to the people that you are attracted to? Most people will start naming all of these qualities. They might name things that you have in common. They might name values that you have similar. They might even say things like something about your physical appearance. I'm attracted to a certain kind of physical appearance. And while all of those contribute to attraction and intimacy, what research has shown very consistently over and over again is that the number one thing that leads to a greater likelihood of whether or not people are going to become attracted to each other, whether or not they will be willing to be intimate with each other as far as sharing details, is actually none of those things. What's the number one predictor is actually just how close you are in physical proximity to the other person. This is why there's a lot of sitcoms based on things like workplace relationships, or people will say that they met their spouse or whatever at some sort of workplace interaction, because you're spending a lot of time with that person in that space. You've had a lot more interaction. You've been available to do that interaction. And that leads to sort of this development of friendship. Something else that we know that's related is that sometimes even just anticipating that you're going to interact with somebody can also lead to more friendship and attraction. And one of the neat things that's sort of related to this is this idea of mere exposure. In other words, if you're introduced to something that's new repeatedly, you're going to be more likely, at least if you initially had a pleasant or neutral experience, the more you are exposed to that thing, you're going to actually increase your liking for it. Now, this can actually happen with something you initially dislike too. You can eventually start to like it, but the effect is a lot stronger if the initial interaction is either positive or neutral. In other words, exposure, sometimes even if you're not aware that you're being exposed repeatedly to something, can lead to liking. So let's go back to that workplace sort of analogy. You've got two people you've never met before that you've been at work, but here you are working with each other every single day. And again, there's going to be a little bit of downtime, and that's when you're going to start to share things about each other. But you're also going to see how that person works. So you're going to be getting subtle messages about people that you wouldn't normally get, because you have to learn, how do they handle adversity, for example, at work? What do they do when they're stressed? What happens when they're busy? Why were they late the other day? Maybe they'll give you some details about their life. So again, you're with somebody every single day, or at least much more frequently than you are with other people. And that alone is usually enough, right, to lead to friendship and attraction, and is actually the number one predictor. All right, so after that, after your actual proximity to each other, or anticipating that you're going to be interacting with each other or being exposed to that person repeatedly due to something like school or work, what comes next? Well, then we do start to have some of those other things that people usually think of. The third thing that we think is pretty important is actual physical attractiveness. People have certain kinds of things that they find more attractive, which is why occasionally, for example, magazines put out these things all the time of the sexiest man alive, or the sexiest woman alive, or person of the year, or something like that. And sometimes, again, you're looking at it and you're going, I don't get it. I don't understand it. And the other times you're like, oh yeah, that makes total sense to me. Well, that's because everybody has different standards in their mind when it comes to physical attractiveness. There are some things that are fairly common amongst all people. For example, symmetrical faces, regardless of gender, are typically rated as being more attractive than not symmetrical faces. But even that isn't 100% reliable amongst everyone. There are individual differences among everyone. But the important part is, whatever you find to be physically attractive, whatever, again, you think are good qualities about a person's physical appearance, are going to predict, right, how likely you are to then seek out that person for a relationship. And again, it doesn't even just mean attraction. It doesn't just mean physical, intimate, sexual kind of relationship. It can actually just mean friendship as well. And then there's something that's really interesting called the matching phenomenon. And this is a tendency in both men and women do it, but we tend to choose partners that and this is usually even sort of subconscious, but we feel like are a good match for us in attractiveness and other traits. So attractiveness is just one of the traits here, but usually we try to find somebody basically that matches us, right? So however we sort of feel about ourselves intellectually, we try to find somebody that matches that. However we feel about ourselves attractive-wise, we try to find somebody that sort of matches that. And again, it may not make sense to anybody externally looking at the relationship, but again, it's sort of this kind of subconscious thing that we do. And we think that there's an element to it of comfort, right? So this is familiar because this is sort of my level of attractiveness. This is my level of intellect. This is my level of value. We also think there's also, besides just familiar and comfort, we think there's this level of, it reduces any sort of kind of conflict or tension, right? If you find somebody that's very similar to you, you don't have some of those sort of conflict and tension points that might disrupt a friendship, for example. This is a little bit of a silly but old reference here. There was a show called How I Met Your Mother. I think there's even a new show spinoff now of How I Met Your Father. But anyway, from How I Met Your Mother, there was this one character that was always trying to attract people so that he could be in a relationship with them. And usually it was just like a one-night stand or something like that. But his key that he said always worked is that you needed to always wear a suit and look your best. And so he had this phrase he would say of suit up. And so this is kind of a montage of that character saying that over and over again, sort of as a joke, but to help remember the idea here. Still related to this idea of physical attractiveness, there's also something called the physical attractiveness stereotype. So this is actually going to lead us into some other things, but in this particular unit of stereotype, prejudice, discrimination. But we sort of have this idea, and think about like any Disney movie that you've seen recently, pretty much any movie ever, but we sort of have this assumption that physically attractive people possess other socially desirable traits. So if you find somebody to be physically attractive, you consider that a positive thing. We, for whatever reason, tend to link that with other positive traits, true or not. So people that are physically attractive are usually judged as being more intelligent. They're usually judged as being more honest. They're usually judged as being more kind. So again, think about the stereotypical like Disney princess versus Disney villain kind of thing, right? The villain is usually drawn purposely to be not as physically attractive, and they have negative qualities. The Disney princess is typically drawn to supposed to be stereotypically attractive, so they are also then linked with all these other good qualities. It leads to this kind of idea, this beautiful is good stereotype. But what we know is that it's not necessarily accurate. That's because it's a stereotype. Stereotypes are not in and of themselves always accurate. What we do know is that attractive people do tend to be valued and favored more because of all of this. So kind of as a self-serving thing, they tend to develop more self-confidence. They're typically given more opportunities versus other people. So again, it sort of feeds itself within this own system, and that's how a stereotype can be fairly damaging. Even in this case, a good stereotype, if you will, of somebody that's attractive is also smart, or attractive is also kind, or something like that. But again, this is very much a self-fulfilling prophecy kind of situation. One of the ones that people tend to find very funny, especially when it's broken, and comedians will take advantage of this, for example, is an elderly person is usually associated with being very kind or gentle or wise. And so it's sort of used as a humor mechanism when there's an elderly person that doesn't then meet those stereotypes, that is not kind, an elderly person that is not wise, an elderly person that is not whatever some of those stereotypes are. So again, this idea of physical attractiveness, it does tend to lead to friendship and attraction, but only because we associate certain qualities with it. And again, this can actually backfire. So think about the movie Mean Girls, for example, right? Like all of those girls, at least according to that friend group, were considered to be physically attractive, but they definitely didn't have some of the other traits of being nice and kind. In fact, quite the opposite. That was the whole point of the movie. But again, people judged them as being this good group because they were attractive. So it's like they gave them, even though they weren't even acting that way, these other qualities simply because of their attractiveness. So who do we typically find attractive? Well, again, there is this idea of symmetry, and there's also this idea of certain shape, sizes of faces and versus body parts. So kind of this perfect average of kind of ratio of body size, eye size, the distance between the eyes, the amount of forehead, the distance of the torso, the length of the legs, all of these kinds of things. But why is what we sort of think about. Well, part of it has got to be evolutionarily. We do know that our ancient ancestors selected individuals based on the health of that individual. So more symmetrical bodies, more average type bodies typically was a signal that that person was biologically healthier, meaning they didn't have some sort of weird gene abnormality, or they had not inherited some new variation of a trait that may or may not make them more capable of surviving in a situation. So it wasn't so much that they had to be perfect as much as they just had to be whatever was going to be healthy in that situation. And so those that had those particular traits were viewed by ancient ancestors as being healthier, thus more likely to be a better mate, or at least better to be able to be in their tribe group, because they're going to be able to survive better. So we have sort of these biological beauty signals sort of built in. Health is definitely the first thing, but related to this idea of health is fertility. And fertility gets associated with youth. And so there's these things that are still sort of built into us just as humans of why we might link certain traits together. Again, this does not necessarily make them accurate, but it gives us sort of an explanation of why we might have some of these initial assumptions and stereotypes being formed. Something else that we do is we use the contrast effect. We compare ourselves and others to things that are around us or to images that we've just seen. This can be why social media or media in general can be very damaging to relationships. If all you're seeing is this idea of the perfect body or the perfect way to look or the perfect way to be, we think this is part of why we're seeing such a rise in anxiety and depression rates in most adults, but also definitely in our teenagers. And we think it has a lot to do with the idea of we're not feeling like that we're meeting certain beauty standards. We're contrasting ourselves versus that we're seeing around us, when what we're seeing around us may not even be accurate. I mean, if you think about it, people use filters, people use certain ways of photographing themselves or viewing themselves, right? They're only going to post the ones that are perfect. They're not going to post the pictures like I normally take where your mouth is half open and you're like, ugh, right? Because, right, that's not the image that we want to display to each other. So think back to the last unit of impression management, right? Or actually, that was the very first unit. But because of that, because of all we're seeing are these highly perfected, perfect pictures that people are willing to show, this contrast effect feels a lot more extreme than it ever used to before. I remember growing up, you had picture day at school and you took your picture and it was what it was. And if you had a goofy smile, your goofy smile was going in the yearbook. And if it was just this, it was a lot less clean and pretty and precise. And there was no redo and there was no, anything like that. So there were no filters, that sort of thing. So what we've basically come up against is that we've started having unrealistic sexual images, and not just our centerfold models, but we have all of these images of individuals. And what we have found research-wise is that men have rated their wives as less attractive and desirable when they view this. Women also tend to do this as well with their partners. It's not nearly as extreme. But what we also know is that when people rate themselves, both men and women, they will rate themselves as less attractive after seeing images of attractive celebrities. So there is definitely something that alters our psyche of how we view others, but actually also how we view ourselves when we surround ourselves with all of these images, particularly if those images have been altered or filtered or photoshopped or something. We also know that the people that we like, the people that we love, we're going to find them more attractive. This is really sort of funny when I've talked to people that have been in a relationship and they'll rate their attractiveness of the people they're in a relationship with, and then, however long later they exit the relationship and you sort of ask them and you're talking about their ex at this point, and it's like they start naming all these negative things that they never spoke about before. And part of this is that idea of, you want to see the best about your mate, you want to see the best about your spouse, but part of it is that actually our brain will actually manufacture increased attractiveness to someone that you like, to people that you love, to people that you have invested time with, and not just those that you're going to be in a romantic relationship with, but even like your friend groups. Likable people are seen as more attractive. So if you like someone, you will rate them as more attractive no matter what. All right, so carrying on with some next things that are important, we know that there's sort of two interesting things that can happen here. So the first one hopefully is a little more obvious. Similarity basically leads to attraction. Similarity leads to friendship. If you can find something that you have in common, not necessarily physical attractiveness or physical similarity at this point, although that can be, but what I'm talking about now is more ideas, thoughts, values, things that you like, things that you enjoy, like movies or hobbies or something like that. Similarity definitely leads to friendship and attraction. Sometimes that's the first thing that you have when you meet someone that you're ultimately going to go on to become friends with, is that you find that you have this one thing in common, like, oh, we like this same book, or oh, we like this same hobby, or the same sports team, or whatever it might be. So this is kind of the concept of birds of a feather flock together. People that like the same thing or that are very similar in a way are going to stay together. So we do know that likeness begets liking. In other words, if you are like someone, if you have something in common, it's going to usually result in you liking that person. Dissimilarity also, kind of in the opposite of that, can breed dislike. For whatever reason, people will dislike someone simply because they cheer for another sports team, or they'll dislike someone because they don't like doing a certain thing, or because they do a different thing from the way that you do it. I remember the weirdest example I saw of this was when I was in college. I was part of this honor society group, and within that group, we sort of had these little subdivisions of the type, because we had to do a service project. Everybody had to do a service project to be part of this honor society. And we had different sorts of opportunities. And there was one main group where our service project, this is the one I was part of, we would go and we would work on a Habitat for Humanity house. We would go a couple times a year to actually work on building a house. The other group did other kinds of service activities. And they did all kinds of different things. They didn't have like one set thing. They sort of changed theirs up and it sort of rotated. And again, I could care less, to be honest, but there were a lot of individuals within both groups that sort of almost got competitive between the two groups, even though we're all doing service projects. But there's just this little bit of dissimilarity, because it was like you're either in the Habitat for Humanity group or you're in the other group, right? And it's almost like we automatically are drawn to that concept. We like creating in-groups. We like creating out-groups. And what we're going to do with our out groups is we're going to find how we're not similar, even though we were already similar because we were in the same honor society. But we found a way, even within an in group, to make an out group. And that actually started breeding dislike. There was kind of competition between the groups as to who was doing more of a service project and which service project was more important and all this. And it's like, seriously, it's like we like to find things to fight over. It was kind of funny. But at the same time, even though we know similarity is important, we also know that opposites can attract. What's really funny is this idea of complementarity, is that basically, in a relationship between two people, what we can find is that sometimes the reason the relationship works and the reason the relationship is so strong is because those two people complement each other. They complete each other. They make up for what one has and the other does not have. And so it's sort of, that's where it looks as almost as if they are opposites. But what we also tend to find is that people that are in relationships like that, where they are compensating for each other or somehow completing each other by making up for the other person, is that they do have so many other things sort of behind the scenes that they do still have in common. So there is still usually some element of similarity, even if kind of surface level, it doesn't look like it. And so I have a lot of times where people will talk to me, and not necessarily at school, but in other places. And if you sort of look at me and my spouse, we look different from kind of the surface level of things, right? Here I am, I have a PhD, I'm a professor in college. I'm actually going back and working on a master's degree. And then my spouse didn't even go to college, went to a year or two of college, but didn't finish an actual college degree, does at least have their high school degree. But even if you go back as far as high school, I was number one in my class. My spouse was the last in their class. And so you're sort of looking at it and you're like, what is the deal here? But what I always tell people is that you have to sort of dig a little deeper. First of all, the two of us compensate for each other very nicely. Even on something silly like whether we're going to be on time for something, right? I am always late. My spouse is always on time, in fact, early, right? You put the two of us together and we complement nicely. We usually get where we're going to go because my spouse keeps me from being late, that sort of thing. I keep my spouse from being so early that it's awkward. We're good complements for each other in that way. But even if you really take a look at just our education level, we're both at the top of our field, right? My husband has a license in the state of South Carolina to be a general contractor. That's the top sort of thing that you can get in that field. I have the top degree in my field. So even though we didn't go to school for the same number of years, right, I actually think sort of behind the scenes, we're equally intelligent. We have more of that similarity than it might seem. The difference is just in what type of degree or what type of education that we got. So the difference is actually education, not intelligence. And for us, that doesn't feel so bad because our intelligence feels more similar. So it's really funny too when you start looking at both of these and you look at any particular couple or any particular group of friends, you're going to probably see some things that seem kind of opposite. Usually if there is, it's going to be because it's complementing something else, which is why it still is very helpful almost to the friendship. But even if you look deeper, you're going to find there's usually more similarities than anything else. We also know that we like people that like us. This is sort of the whole plot of the show of Big Bang Theory, is that eventually this couple got together because this character liked this character. And that was sort of the whole first couple of seasons, is him basically making it very obvious that he liked her. So how can we get others to like us? And again, not just to lead to a romantic relationship, but anything. Well, flattery. Flattery works, but it depends on how the person that's being flattered interprets the flattery. If the flattery feels sincere, it's going to work very well. If the flattery feels fake and like you're just doing it to get somewhere, it's not going to work at all. So it can actually totally backfire. And so this is the idea of ingratiation. Ingratiation is using strategies like flattery, but as a tool to seek somebody's favor. And again, it works if the flattery seems sincere. If it doesn't, it actually can backfire on you. Your self-esteem is also important. So how you feel about yourself, how you feel about yourself within relationships is actually important. You need to feel like you are worthy of someone liking you. And sometimes that can take a little bit of work on yourself, but I've seen relationships get sabotaged because of that both people liked each other, but one person did not have the self-esteem to feel as if they should be liked by the other person, and it sabotaged the relationship. We also know that sometimes we'll be in relationships because we get something out of it. There is the reward theory of attraction. So this is the idea that we like people whose behavior is rewarding to us or whom we associate with rewarding events. This happens all the time on my class course reviews. And again, I can tell how old this slide is because I left my maiden name on there. But basically what I always find is that people that tend to get A's in my class tend to write very positive things about me. People that tend to get D's or F's tend to write, oh, Dr. West is mean, Dr. West is not fair, Dr. West doesn't respond to anything. And not that any of those are true or false, it's just people that get the thing that they want, which is usually a good grade, will say more positive things than people that don't get a good grade. And it's even more exaggerated, especially on private stuff, for example, like Rate My Professor. My favorite example of this from forever ago. And I can't prove who did it, although I think I know who did it. But most of the time, the people that got decent grades in my class would have gone on to Rate My Professor and said good things like, yeah, class was fine, blah, 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 blah. But I had this one student, and I think I know which student it was, who consistently complained, hated the class, blah, 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 and wrote on the Rate My Professor, worst professor ever, makes us play with candy or something like that in class, because I had this demonstration at the time. It was a biology class about evolution. But it was just really funny that it's like, but that person also did horribly. I don't know if they just didn't study correctly or whatever, but they ended up getting like a really low D in the class. And it's like, is it really that you don't like me? You don't like the way I teach? Or is it that you're not getting the grades that you want? Like if you had gotten an A, would you still have complained about the activity online? Hard to say. But my guess is, based on this idea, is that no, they probably would not have. Because again, if we feel like we're getting something useful out of the relationship, we're a lot more likely to rate the relationship as good. So the last little bit of stuff I want to talk about is sort of moving in from just generally liking someone into this idea of love and what is love. There is different forms of love. Passionate love is just a state of intense longing for a union with another person. Passionate lovers are very absorbed in each other. They love obtaining their person's love. They are very, very sad if they should ever lose that love, both because the relationship falls apart or because one of the partners is no longer. So what we know is that passionate love is very emotional, it's very exciting, it's very intense. And then there's a lot of different forms of love depending on, which sort of theory that you use. This is one different theory here that says that love itself, the ultimate form of love, is called consummate love, and it includes three major elements. Those elements would be intimacy, which is just liking of someone, passion, which is just your infatuation, how passionate you are about that person, and then commitment or decision commitment. And so what we know is that if you have just one of these elements, it can lead to a part of attraction and liking. So intimacy can lead to liking, passion can lead to curiosity or infatuation about a person, and then decision can lead to commitment or empty love, if you will. So it's like I don't really have the emotion, but I have the need to stay here. You combine any two of these. So for example, if you combine intimacy and decision, what you get is companionate love, right? So I'm committed to being here because I like you. This could be, we're more like companions. So maybe you're in an intimate relationship, but also maybe you're just friends. This will be a good level for friendship. Intimacy plus passion gives you romantic love. So maybe you're not necessarily committed, but you feel super romantic. Passion plus decision making gives you what you call fatuous love. But again, the ideal is not just having two. If you're going to be in a one-on-one relationship with a partner, the idea would be to have consummate love, which is elements of all three of the main components. Going back to the idea of passionate love, we have this two-factor theory of emotions. We talked about this before a little bit. The idea of passionate love would be that in a romantic context, arousal from any source can actually be steered into passion. So this is a really weird characteristic of passion, and just a really weird way that people make their emotions work. So anytime we have a huge emotional arousal, your body only has so many ways to respond, right? Your sympathetic nervous system, think about like the idea of adrenaline rush, can only produce so many kinds of responses in your body. And what's super important there, and this is where the two factors come in, is that you sort of think about, all right, what is the situation? What is going on here? And depending on how you think about it will help you then explain that what you're feeling, and then that will lead to those two factors of how I'm feeling, how my body is getting aroused, how my brain is thinking will lead to the two factors of the emotion that you feel. So what we tend to see is that people, when they first get into a relationship, it's great, it's passionate, they're wonderful, everybody's excited and it's happy, and then after a while it just kind of wears off. And this is really natural, right? Our emotion levels tend to come down over time. And so people will kind of freak out, like, well, what am I doing? What's wrong? Why am I never in a good relationship? Why do my relationships always fall apart? Well, it's not necessarily that it doesn't fall apart. That's a normal thing to happen, is to have emotion levels come down after a while. So this idea here to take advantage of the two-factor theory of emotion is do things together that's going to reignite your body, that's going to reignite your sort of adrenaline rush. And again, it doesn't even have to be sexual or anything like that. I'm just talking about go and do something that you wouldn't normally do that might make you excited. Go on that hike to that mountain that you always wanted to see. Go to Carowinds and get on a roller coaster. Go try a new food, something that's going to get you excited. But then do it with the partner, do it with the spouse, do it with the partner. And what you're going to find is that if you allow yourself to think, this is fun, I do fun things with my partner. If you basically attribute the fun thing, the arousal, the exciting situation to your partner, right? Your brain will then interpret it as, well, but this partner is what makes it fun. This partner is what makes it exciting, and it can reignite sort of that passion that you felt at the beginning. This can even happen with negative experiences too, even painful experiences. You can steer them into passion. So you can be very upset about something, but then you attribute to, this person is going to make me feel better. This person is going to care for me. This person is going to help me with my pain. And that can actually lead to a strengthening of love as well. So I talked a little bit about companionate love. Basically, again, it's the idea that, again, after we have felt affection for a while, Some of the passion tends to fade. This is very normal. So if you don't do some of those activities to increase it, that's fine. And it's not necessarily a bad kind of love to have, but this is sort of the idea of how your consummate love can sort of fade over time into companionate love. And then also related to this is how attached you are to somebody. We have a human need to be attached. We need to feel like we belong to a group or belong to another person. This should start at the very beginning of your life with feeling the need to be attached in your family, so parents and children. But it's also important for your friends, your spouses, all of those kinds of things. There are 4 major kinds of attachment styles, and depending on which attachment style you have sort of learned to do over time, can ultimately go on and affect other relationships. And you can learn new attachment styles as you grow older. So don't feel like if you've been stuck in one, or if you learned one as a child, especially if it was unhealthy, for example, down here, like the dismissive or the fearful attachment, that you can't then go back and ultimately relearn a more healthy one. This first one is the most healthy, which is secure attachment. This is when you're able to trust someone that you're in a relationship with. It's marked by intimacy, and again, not necessarily sexual intimacy, but intimacy in that you're willing to reveal personal details about yourself. You're willing to tell people when you're afraid. You're willing to tell people when you're happy. You're willing to tell people when you need help. Those are the signs of intimacy. And again, that would be the most secure form of attachment and the ideal form of attachment. And all of these others are forms of attachment that typically form in not as healthy relationships, but that need to then ultimately be sort of unlearned so that you can relearn to be securely attached. Also important is the amount of equity. What we know is that you need to feel like you're getting something out of the relationship that's equal to what you're putting into the relationship. No one really likes a long-term relationship where they feel like they're the only one contributing. Even something as simple as household chores, right? If one person feels like they're always doing all the work and the other person is kind of slacking off, that's actually going to possibly lead to a relationship ending because there's not going to be this feel of equity. So equity is important, but equity can be defined very individually for each particular relationship. So each particular coupling, each particular friend situation needs to define sort of for themselves what equity looks like and what equity feels like. And the more mature relationships are going to be willing to actually have more formalized discussions about it. Whereas more immature relationships are just going to, they might feel a certain way, particularly if they're not getting the equity part, but they may not express that. They don't feel like things are equitable in a very healthy way. And that can actually cause troubles in and of itself, how you express whether or not you are feeling equitable. We also know that your willingness to disclose things about yourself is going to lead to intimacy, and intimacy is really important for relationships. So self-disclosure is just revealing any sort of intimate aspect about yourself. And what we've seen defined is that when one person does it, the other person tends to reciprocate, or we tend to be very uncomfortable if we disclose and the other person does not reciprocate. If you tell some intimate detail about yourself and then the other person doesn't give it back to you, that can feel almost worse, right, than telling somebody your intimate thing. Is the fact that they did not want to share your level of intimacy. But again, self-disclosure, revealing intimate aspects about yourself. So how do relationships actually end? Well, hopefully they don't. But if you're actually formally married, you will need to divorce, which is like a legal way of saying that we are no longer in a relationship. Divorce rates vary widely around the country and also between different countries. Individualistic cultures tend to have more divorce than communal cultures do. But there's a lot of external factors that can alter the divorce rate in any given time. Right now, COVID has played some weird messes on the divorce rate by both increasing it and decreasing it. As weird as that is, probably the decrease was due to the fact that people didn't have the ability to go and get divorced or didn't really have anywhere to go. But now that the world is sort of reopening, we're seeing divorce rates go way, way back up, probably because people spent a lot of time together. So again, we're not even sure what to make of it yet. We just see the numbers coming in and we're starting to look at them. But what we do know is that there is sort of a detachment process that occurs when a relationship is ending. And this is much more extreme in a situation where you've got a coupling that's legally bound to each other, for example, a married couple. versus just like a friend group, although this definitely can happen in a friend group as well. So the detachment process, you sort of just kind of separate from each other. But then there are some alternatives that can happen during that detachment process. So you can find that people might stick it out. We think of that sort of as a loyalty thing. Basically, I'm going to wait until conditions improve. Maybe the person's just stressed right now. Maybe they're just going through a hard time, something like that. You can neglect, basically just ignore the partner and allow the relationship to deteriorate just because you're not going to invest in that relationship. And you can also voice your concerns, which is out of these three the healthiest, because typically it can lead to at least the ability to take active steps to improve the relationship. In other words, letting the other person know what's going on, giving them the opportunity to hear you, giving them the opportunity to then express themselves, and then hopefully working together as a couple to try to help each other meet each other's needs is definitely the healthiest way to prevent a relationship from ending, versus simply detaching from each other and letting the relationship fall apart. All right, that was sort of scratching the surface of intimacy and liking and this pro-social relationship type of thing. We will talk again soon about some other kinds of relationships as we move forward. Have a good one.